is CGTN, China Global Television Network. Live from London, this is Global Business.
Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Jamie Owen.
And I'm Robin Dwyer. Our top stories. Eurozone business activity slows more than expected in May, the first decline since October last year. We'll be assessing what's behind the flatlining.
Our other headlines, Russia says it's pushed back Ukrainian fighters it blames for attacks on the border city of Belgorod.
Artillery fire and clashes are reported in Sudan's capital, Khartoum, on the first full day of a new ceasefire.
And time really is money. The watch, once owned by China's last emperor, is sold at auction for $6.2 million. The European economy is flatlining, at least in some areas. Business activity in the Eurozone slowed more than expected in May. The Composite Purchasing Managers Index, which tracks business trends in the service and manufacturing sectors, fell from 54.1 in April to 53.3 in May. That's the first decline since October last year. A score of 50 separates growth from contraction.
The manufacturing downturn has deepened. The decline from 45.8 in April to 44.6 puts it further into contraction territory as new orders continue to fall. But demand for services remains strong, beating expectations, although the index did fall from 56.2 in April to 55.9.
The UK is no longer expected to go into recession this year or have the weakest economic growth in the G7. That's according to the International Monetary Fund, which says Britain's economy will grow by 0.4% in 2023. Germany is now predicted to have the slowest growth of any G7 country this year, with Europe's largest economy expected to stagnate around about zero.
Well, let's talk to Melanie De Bono, who's Senior Europe Economist at the research consultancy Pantheon Macroeconomics. Good to see you again, Melanie. So these Eurozone figures down, unpack them for us. What do they really mean?
So actually, the PMIs this morning were a bit of a mixed bag. So the main index, as you mentioned, has fallen in May, but based on its past relationship with GDP, it actually points to Eurozone GDP growth picking up to 0.5% quarter-on-quarter in Q2 from the measly 0.1% expansion we saw in the first quarter of the year. As from our point of view, we think that this is probably a bit too optimistic, and that's because the services PMI is staying robust or continuing to be strong because it's capturing solid nominal activity, and therefore it's not capturing the weakness in real activity. As we know, the firms are not asked to respond to what happened to activity on a inflation-adjusted basis, but rather just what changes in activity have happened over the past months, and prices have been rising. What's more, the index excludes construction, which is likely to have quite a tough quarter this time around after a really good Q1. And other leading indicators, such as the banking data, actually are quite downbeat on the Eurozone economy. So from our point of view, we don't really believe the PMI, and we're forecasting that the Eurozone economy just trudges along near zero growth all the way out to the third quarter of this year.
As you point out, though, demand for services is strong, whereas there's been a decline in manufacturing. How can policymakers deal with that split?
Well, it's hard to. At this point, we've had years where services demand has been suppressed due to COVID lockdowns and restrictions. And now that consumers can go out again, this is what they want to spend on. There's no such thing as capping prices, or at least when you fall into that trap for economies, it gets pretty hard to come out of that equation. So it's quite a difficult one for policymakers to deal with.
So what do you think it does suggest about the future for inflation and for interest rates?
So inflation should continue to fall. So it rose a bit in April, minutely, but it should come down again based on the fact that energy price levels have remained low and due to energy pace effects. The PMIs this morning, they suggest that firms are still raising prices quite strongly, particularly in services, particularly because services firms are still seeing high input costs because of higher wage demands now. So what does that mean? Inflation should fall, but the risks are to it staying high, and the ECB will be seeing this. Inflation expectations are also quite high. So over the coming months, we suspect that the European Central Bank will hike further. As we know also from earlier this month, the President Christine Lagarde said, them pivoting from 50 basis point hikes in recent months to 25 basis points is not them taking a pause. So we think they will hike again by 25 basis points at each of their June and July meetings, taking the deposit rate to 3.75% this year.
And I want to ask you about the IMF's forecast, particularly on the health of the UK economy, because it's had a bit of an upgrade, hasn't it? But is it all good news?
Not quite. So we too think that the United Kingdom will avoid recession this year, but we look for only sluggish growth from here as households and businesses respond to higher interest rates. Of course, we know that the Bank of England, like the ECB, has raised policy rates quite substantially over recent months, and our forecast is a touch higher than the IMF's, actually at 0.5% for GDP growth in the United Kingdom this year.
Melanie, good to talk to you. Thanks very much indeed for joining us today. That's Melanie De Bono from Pantheon Macroeconomics.
Thank you.
Climate protesters have stormed a meeting of shareholders at the offices of the energy giant Shell in London. They're calling for the company to align its carbon targets to the Paris Climate Agreement by the year 2030 and focus more resources towards renewables. Rising oil and gas prices caused by the war in Ukraine have led to big profits for energy companies. In February, Shell reported a record-breaking profit of nearly $40 billion for 2022. That's double the previous year's total.
Tesla is selling its China-produced Model 3 and Model Y vehicles in Canada. It comes after the electric car maker completed its first shipments to North America from its Shanghai factory. Both models qualified for federal incentives of $3,700 in Canada. Tesla Shanghai accounted for more than half of the company's production last year.
People in Hong Kong will be allowed to buy and sell cryptocurrencies from the 1st of June. Cryptocurrency prices moved higher after the announcement. It's all part of broader efforts by Hong Kong's authorities to make the city a global crypto hub. Crypto trading is banned on the Chinese mainland. Greece is counting on tourism to revive its economy this year. The minister in charge of the sector says that summer bookings are already pointing to a new record. Many of those bookings are being made by tourists from China. Our correspondent Evangelos Ipsas reports.
One of the largest islands in Greece and a popular holiday destination, the island of Corfu is a jewel in the Ionian Sea. Every year, over 1 million holidaymakers travel here. Among the tiny Venetian streets and the medieval castles is where China's Fosun Tourism Group purchased its latest luxury 5-star hotel under the brand Cook's Club. General Manager Vasilis Kastinos is preparing for a summer without any restrictions.
Για μας ήταν το ξεκίνημα, ήταν κάτι πιλωτικό.
After years of the pandemic and renovations, we opened our doors last year, but only as a pilot project. This year will be a true test for Greece and for us as well. We're better prepared and know what our clients want. That's why our bookings are higher than expected.
The 195-room hotel is offering high-tech services, like digital food ordering, which aims to cut down on food waste. Cook's Club is the latest investment, joining other 8 hotels under the Fosun umbrella on the island of Rhodes, Samos, Mykonos, Crete, Kos, and Evia. And all are expected to be busy, with Greece's tourism ministry predicting another breaking record season. Passenger traffic at Greece's largest airport, Athens International, is already up by 74% in the first 2 months compared to 2022. That's also a rise of 3% on 2019's pre-pandemic levels. The summer tourism season has just started, and it's expected to last at least until October or even November if the sun continues to shine. During that period, more than 30 million people are expected to visit the country, making tourism the backbone of Greece's economy. Most of those tourists fly through Athens or Thessaloniki and travel onwards from there. Now, the government is aiming to change that by giving financial incentives for airlines to offer more direct flights.
We even made some agreements with airline companies in order to be able to partly subsidize winter flights as well, because we do realize that the main point of discussion here is direct flights or the regularity, of course, of flights that come to Greece, not just to Athens and Thessaloniki, but also to the regional airports. So we have prepared for that. Drafting agreements with airline companies, with large tour operators.
Some of those direct flights have been shifted to Corfu, which sees close to 2,000 flights a month from May to September, carrying more than 500,000 visitors each month. The tourism sector, including China's Fosun Group, are hoping more flights and an extended tourism season will see sunny times ahead for their investment. Evangelos Sipsas for CGTN from the island of Corfu.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead, we're in Sudan next, where a new ceasefire has just begun, with reports of continued fighting.
Ever wondered what's the difference between a bear and a bull market? Where are the cash cows? And who are the lame ducks? And what exactly are black swans? Grey rhinos? And unicorn companies? Make sense of it all with Global Business, only on CGTN.
There's a new agenda for a new world, accelerating change in almost every part of our lives. It's shifting the norms of how we work, travel, and connect. How we think, interact, and develop. It's a new reality, a new agenda with me, Juliet Mann.
Welcome back to Global Business Europe. Artillery fire and clashes have been reported in Sudan's capital, Khartoum, on the first day of a new ceasefire.
The 7-day humanitarian truce, which began on Monday, is meant to allow for the delivery of aid. It was brokered following talks in Jeddah and is being monitored by Saudi Arabia and the United States.
The Sudanese army and paramilitary rapid support forces have been locked in a power battle since April. At least 850 people have been killed in the conflict, with more than 1 million displaced.
Let's talk to our correspondent Naba Moeddin in Madani. Naba, what more can you tell us?
On the ground, the ceasefire seems to be not holding, at least in northeastern Khartoum, where the military is chasing mobile units of RSF, and people or residents of Khartoum witnessed heavy fightings in the first hour of the ceasefire when it has entered into force. But this morning was calmer for people, or relative calm, and people could be able to shop and get supplies this morning. So the ceasefire, there is fighting in some areas in the capital, particularly particularly in northeastern Khartoum and eastern Khartoum, but elsewhere is relative calm and people can move safer than the past 5 weeks since the fighting broke out in the capital Khartoum. But the humanitarian situation is still dire, Jamie, and people cannot get enough food or medicine or aid. Most of the international humanitarian aid organizations and local, they are still studying ways to deliver that aid for hundreds of thousands of people who are still in the capital and also for people in the borders as they live a border crisis. So the situation is not improving regarding the humanitarian situation and health situation, but the ceasefire seems to be better than the past 7 ceasefire, Jamie.
I mean, the whole point of this ceasefire was to allow for the safe passage of medicines and food. I mean, locally, from the people you're talking to, what is your sense of the humanitarian situation?
Actually, Jamie, some of the aid was delivered for people like in Al Jazeera state where I'm staying right now, and there was also some trucks there were delivered for people in Khartoum and other trucks in Western Darfur and in the borders with Chad. But as I told you before, Jamie, it's not enough for people, and there is still unsafe roads for humanitarian aid workers, and the ceasefire is just has entered into force just a few hours ago. So all of the humanitarian aid organizations and people are monitoring it, and they are fearing a collapse of it at any moment. There is aid provided, but it's not as much as needed. There is also a border crisis with Chad. More than 60,000 people fled the war from Western Darfur to Chad, and they were provided by aid, but it was not enough for vulnerable women and children who are staying in very vulnerable situation. And there is also fear of the coming weeks. The rainy season shall start in Chad within few weeks, and the UN said they can't relocate those people safely because the rainy season means bigger streams will open that will make it difficult to get supplies or to move people. So there is a crisis right now, Jamie, and it may get worse by the time ahead.
Naba, thank you for that. Our correspondent Naba Moeddin in Madani.
The White House and congressional Republican negotiators are meeting again to try and resolve a months-long stalemate over raising the US government's debt ceiling. It comes just 9 days from the deadline, with the country at risk of an unprecedented default. Well, let's talk to our correspondent, John Terrett in New York. So, John, I have asked you this question before, but has any progress been made yet?
You have. No. Thanks very much. Back to you. Well, what do you expect me to say? I mean, what would you want me to say? I've told you all along. This is coming down to the wire, folks. This is not over yet. Kevin McCarthy, Robin, is the senior Republican in America, okay? Until somebody gets the nod for the White House in 2024, most likely Donald Trump at the moment, according to the opinion polls. Until that happens, Kevin McCarthy is the boss, okay? So he meets yesterday with Joe Biden at the White House, and this is what he's saying this morning. He's saying, we're nowhere near a deal, hang with us. So, I mean, what more do you need to know? The problem is the Republicans only do this when they can't get what they want any other way and when there's a Democratic president in power. So we last saw it in 2011 and also 2013. That was the last time we experienced this. The Republicans are seeking very, very deep spending cuts, but they want to increase the defense spending. Okay, and so that pushes all the cuts that may come back on Democratic favorites like domestic spending, things like, I don't know, it's difficult to pick one. Just pick one. Healthcare, Medicare, I don't know, just name it. That's why there's a real issue between the two and why they are poles apart. Now, the White House is offering, as far as I can see, two things. One is the possibility of freezing the spending for about 10 years, which, if you account for inflation, would amount to a spending cut, which the Republicans want. And also the possibility of restricting the claiming of some benefits. If you are fit and healthy without children, then there's a possibility on the table, I'm told, that Biden might agree to some kind of restrictions because the Republicans want you not to be able to claim those benefits if you don't have children and you are fit and healthy. Anyway, just to wrap this up quickly, the problem we've got here is that time is running coming out. It'll take 72 hours to clear the House. Then it has to go on to the Senate. And next Monday is the major public holiday of Memorial Day. So lurking in the background, too, extremists on both sides, particularly the Republicans in the House, and that is why there is concern that we may end up with a default, potentially a brief one, although New York Stock Exchange, where I am, where once again we haven't paid the bill and the lights have gone out, they're pretty sanguine about it. They're chilling at the Holiday Inn about this at the moment because they think they know how this movie ends.
Well, John, as you say, we can see you just about in the dark there, thanks to the wave. The time has run out for negotiators almost, and time has run out for us. So we will speak to you again tomorrow.
How we get our microchips could be about to change. The COVID pandemic had a major impact on supply chains, particularly electronics, leading to delays and shutdowns in manufacturing. Now there are new countries looking to gain a foothold in that market. Our correspondent Alistair Baverstock reports.
Semiconductor microchips, the technology upon which people increasingly depend for nearly all electronic devices used today. Vital components in anything which uses an internal computer, today the vast majority are manufactured in Asia. Mario Buenrostro is the director of the electrical engineering faculty at Mexico's Anahuac University.
The United States has a deficit, not only in the manufacture of chips, but also in their research and development. And that presents great opportunities for engineers in Mexico.
Last year, the US Congress passed the Chips and Science Act, a piece of legislation aimed at bolstering the research and production of chips in the US. Mexico, too, may now benefit from the initiative. In the city of Guadalajara, often described as Mexico's Silicon Valley, Pascal Aubois runs GDL Circuits, which manufactures electronic systems for the country's manufacture sector.
Pretty soon we are going to have also the chip maker making investment here locally. And in 2024 I believe that some of the first chip will be done here by some French company.
Analysts say Mexico is an ideal place for the semiconductor chip industry.
You have all the talented people. We have 17 universities, so it's very easy to get a new, fresh, let's say, technician or engineer.
Mexico is a large producer of technical engineers, has very good manufacturing quality and excellent logistics when it comes to the supply chain. All we need now is specialization for semiconductor manufacture.
For a highly specialized industry, that takes time.
You need to have a very clean facility, and then they need to bring the equipment from US or from Asia or from Europe. And after you need to educate your people, then you need to qualify your equipment, which is another year. So that's why before the time you have the building and the time you will be producing, it will be minimum 2 years.
Despite the long wait between investment and production, Mexico's Silicon Valley insiders only see their sector growing.
The competition is more present every year. In terms of electronics, we are going to continue to grow.
Alistair Baverstock, CGTN, Guadalajara, Mexico.
You can get highlights from the week's news in Europe and China direct to your inbox from CGTN's Storyboard email newsletter. Sign up at europe.cgtn.com/newsletter.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead, Ukrainian pilots are receiving training to fly F-16 fighter jets, according to the European Union's foreign policy chief. We're in Brussels. Next.
Each day, there are millions of stories. Each one can open new perspectives, new possibilities. Wherever you look, we are there. To see, discover, explore. We put the pieces together to find what really matters to you. All around the world, all around the clock. our reporters are at home across the globe. From our headquarters in Beijing and production centers in Washington, Nairobi, and London, China Global Television Network. Stories from across the globe, reaching people across the globe. CGTN. See the difference. Facing the unknown is always difficult. In a world in turmoil, it's easy to lose orientation. But when the storms come, we have to see the possibilities. Reinvent. Find new opportunities. Discover a path forward. CGTN. See the difference.
What do we mean when we talk about the difference?
Brazen axe.
The difference is in the detail, in the background,
Defense ministers from
the wider angle and perspective of every story. Wherever the story may be. CGTN. See the difference.
Welcome back to Global Business Europe with Jamie Owen and Robin Dwyer. Our top stories. Eurozone business activity slows more than expected in May, the first decline since October last year.
Our other headlines: artillery fire and clashes are reported in Sudan's capital, Khartoum, on the first full day of a new ceasefire. European defence ministers are meeting in Brussels to discuss continued support for Ukraine.
The meeting comes as the European Union's foreign policy chief says Ukrainian pilots are receiving training to fly F-16 fighter jets. Joseph Borrell said training is already taking place in Poland.
Let's talk to our correspondent Alex Cadier in Brussels. Alex, there's been a lot of talk about fighter jets for Ukraine. So what exactly did the defence ministers have to say?
Well, Jamie, the first, perhaps awkward thing to clarify is that shortly after Josep Borrell made those comments saying that training had begun, the Polish defence minister said, no, it hasn't. So that's the first thing to clarify, is that the EU's chief diplomat was not particularly accurate in his statement. A bit of an awkward moment for today's meeting. Now, what are they doing? What is happening is that there is a coalition of European countries that are being put together and talking about starting that training. Now, it's been led in part by the Danes and the Dutch, so the Netherlands, Denmark, Belgium and the UK, no longer an EU members, but still supportive of that coalition. They are, the Dutch defence minister at this meeting saying that they are talking about the timeline to start the training, coordinating their efforts. That is phase one, getting those Ukrainian pilots trained up and looking at how long that will take. Now, there has been a test done in the United States already. Experienced Ukrainian fighter pilots went to the US for training, and as in an intensive course, the estimation by the US was that it would take 3 to 4 months to get them trained up on these F-16. So that gives you the only timeline we have at the moment. Now, why is it taking so long, and why are we just talking about training at the moment? Well, the Dutch defence minister was pressed on this issue. She said, we will talk about planes after we've sorted the training. So that is phase two. We're not there yet. Now, why is there so much difficulty in coordinating this at the moment? Well, F-16s is not like your run-of-the-mill family car. There are different versions running on different softwares. Different countries use them in different ways. And so being able to coordinate that effort and coordinate providing these aircraft to Ukraine is a little bit more complicated than just shipping them out there. Now, for example, the Dutch and the Danes have F-16s that they were planning on getting rid of anyways, and that run on similar software. That's why that coalition includes those two. They were planning on replacing those with American F-35s. Now, that's the core issue as to why this is taking a bit of time, but there's clearly a will on the part of the European defence ministers and European countries to provide these F-16s since Joe Biden and his administration in Washington gave the green light to do so. Now, defence ministers were also joined by Jens Stoltenberg, the NATO Secretary General, who offered his support to the move.
I will leave it to individual allies to make announcement exactly about when they start training. But of course also with the announcement by President Biden this weekend, the US being of course the main provider of, for instance, F-16s, and also announcing clearly that they will start training. This is an important step. That partly will enable us to then deliver fighter jets at some stage, but also is sending a very clear signal that we are there for the long term.
Now, looking at that statement from Jens Stoltenberg, the response from Russia is that deliveries of F-16s would raise the question of NATO's involvement in the conflict. That was addressed again today by Jens Stoltenberg, the NATO Secretary General, saying we are not a party to this conflict. This is a war of aggression. This is a lack of respect for Ukraine's territorial integrity by Russia, and therefore NATO and the European Union are helping Ukraine defend itself but are not involved directly in the conflict. So finally, it'll be a long and complicated road to get these F-16s, but we heard from the Estonian Defence Minister it will certainly happen in the next few months, Jamie.
Alex, thank you for that. Our correspondent Alex Cadier in Brussels.
Russia's Prime Minister Mikhail Mishustin is in China for a two-day visit. Our correspondent Lusa Wei reports.
Russian Prime Minister Mikhail Mishustin has just landed in Beijing. He's on an official visit to China on Tuesday and Wednesday. Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson Wang Wenbin said China and Russia would have in-depth exchanges on relations of both sides, and he also hopes that Mishustin's visit would deepen cultural and people-to-people exchanges and would boost global economic recovery. And the Kremlin earlier has also confirmed that economic and trade cooperation is also on the agenda, and special attention would be given to, for example, industry, agriculture, transport, infrastructure, as well as energy. And so several bilateral agreements are expected to be signed as well this time. And over the years, Moscow and Beijing has close relations. For example, in March this year, Chinese President Xi Jinping has paid an official visit in Russia. There, he said, ties are entering a new era. So Mishustin's visit this time is also considered a concrete step of an increasing strong relations. Lu Sirui, CGTN, Beijing.
Russia says it has pushed back Ukrainian fighters it claims launched a cross-border attack in its western region of Belgorod.
Houses, administrative buildings and a kindergarten were all damaged in the strikes on Monday. Moscow says it's launched an investigation into what it calls a terror attack. Kyiv has denied any involvement. Two Russian-backed anti-Kremlin groups, the Russian Volunteer Corps and the Freedom of Russia Legion, have claimed responsibility.
Well, let's talk to our correspondent Stuart Smith in Moscow. Stuart, what's the Kremlin saying about these attacks?
Well, the latest is that Belgorod, the region that was affected by the incursion, has cancelled its counter-terror operation. So from the perspective of Moscow, this is all wrapped up, apart from the criminal case, which will be ongoing, trying to ascertain who exactly these people were and what crimes under Russian law they are charged with committing. The Kremlin says in order to push back what it calls a sabotage and reconnaissance group, 70 were killed, 4 armoured vehicles destroyed and 5 pickup trucks. The rest, they said, fled back into Ukraine. In terms of the damage done, as well as those buildings that were mentioned just now, there were around 12 civilians. The numbers aren't officially confirmed that were injured, although no one is seemed to have, no civilian is acknowledged to have died during the incursion.
So we have these two Russian-based groups that are claiming responsibility for what's happened. What more do we know about them?
Yeah, one of them was labelled a terrorist organisation earlier in the year, so that means 20 years in jail for anyone found to have been part of it as the maximum sentence. They are considered a massive problem by the Russian government. This is the largest land-based attack that they have undertaken against Russia in Russian territory, but they have variously moved into Russian territory before. It's not the first time something like this has happened. This is just the largest one. They say they're fighting for a different kind of Russia without the President Vladimir Putin in power and a change to what they describe as a regime. But Russia believes this is a Ukrainian-led group supplied and funded by Kyiv in order to provide some kind of plausible deniability when these cross-border raids do happen.
Stuart, thank you very much. Our correspondent Stuart Smith in Moscow.
The head of the United Nations nuclear watchdog has told CGTN he remains deeply concerned about security at Ukraine's Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. IAEA Director General Rafael Grossi says the complex, which has been at the centre of months of shelling, remains unstable. Both Moscow and Kyiv have accused each other of attacking the power station. Grossi spoke to CGTN about the ongoing diplomatic efforts to try to secure the nuclear plant, the biggest in Europe.
We never had a situation like this. Of course, this is in itself already a matter that deserves urgent attention. On top of that, we have seen in the course of the past few months that the plant has been subject to shelling on several occasions. Additionally, the plant, because of the ongoing war, has lost external power supply 6 times. Which means that this, the biggest nuclear power plant in Europe, was on 6 different occasions operating under emergency mode, so to speak, with emergency generators, which is the last line of defense that such a big, huge facility may have to prevent the meltdown of the reactor cores. So, obviously, for us, this presented us with an unprecedented challenge, and we have been fully mobilized. And I am personally leading a process of consultation, negotiation, you may call it in different ways, aimed at getting some basic principles of protection for this facility, because it is clear that no one, it doesn't matter which side a person might take on this tragic conflict that we are seeing, no one will be spared in case of a nuclear accident with major radiological consequences. So as IAEA, I felt from the very beginning that I should get fully involved and try to bring solutions to the table.
India's Prime Minister has received a rock-star reception on his first visit to Australia since 2014. Thousands of members of Australia's Indian community gave a rapturous welcome to Narendra Modi as he attended a rally in Sydney with Prime Minister Anthony Albanese. Modi is looking to boost support from expatriates ahead of next year's election after his party lost a key state vote last month. He will also hold talks with Albanese on Wednesday.
And India has made it compulsory for cough syrup makers to get samples tested before exporting their products. This comes after Indian-made brands were found to include toxins linked to dozens of child deaths in the Gambia and Uzbekistan. India's $41 billion pharmaceutical industry is one of the biggest in the world.
At least 7 people, including children, have been killed after the roof of a school collapsed during a storm in Thailand. Strong winds hit the gymnasium where the students had been sheltering. 18 others were sent to hospital. A warning for heavy rain has been issued for this week, which marks the official start of the rainy season.
Police are searching near a reservoir in Portugal in their investigation into the historic disappearance of a British child. The reservoir is 50 kilometres from where 3-year-old Madeleine McCann was last seen in 2007. German national Christian Bruckner was made a formal suspect by Portuguese authorities last year, but has not been charged and denies involvement. He's known to have visited this area around the time she disappeared.
Pakistan's former Prime Minister Imran Khan has been granted bail until the 8th of June in a number of cases by an anti-terrorism court in the capital, Islamabad. The opposition leader says he's facing nearly 150 legal cases against him since being removed from power last year. Thousands of people staged protests and attacked public property after Khan's arrest earlier this month.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead, after the flooding, the finance next. Help finally on its way to northern Italy. Rome signs off a $2.2 billion relief package.
Events have consequences. Words create impact.
Unprecedented scenes that we saw.
The clean-up operation is now well and truly underway.
Parts of southern Europe remain in a state of emergency.
Context gives meaning. People make history.
far more than 1,000 people have come here today.
But authorities are still on high alert.
So into the attention of world leaders.
A complex world demands a comprehensive view.
But with the cleanup efforts more or less under control,
the economic impact is bound to ripple across the country.
There's plastic pollution everywhere.
Because the world today matters for your world tomorrow.
This is the living area of the crew.
And in these mountains, they recently finished building a power plant.
Well, this is something completely different.
The world today, every day on CGTN.
Welcome back to Global Business Europe. Spain's football authorities have been criticised after the latest incident of racism. Real Madrid player Vinicius Jr. suffered repeated abuse on Sunday from fans in Valencia.
It spiralled into a big row with the head of La Liga after the player said the league belongs to racists. The police have now made a number of arrests. Our correspondent Ken Brown reports.
A reckoning for Spanish football and society. The abuse aimed at Vinicius Jr. on Sunday night in Valencia's Mestalla Stadium has shocked the world. On Monday, the lights went out on Brazil's iconic Christ the Redeemer statue in solidarity with the young star. Today, 3 arrests were made in Valencia after a joint investigation between the police and the football club. In Madrid, 4 more were arrested for a hate crime after they hung an inflatable doll from a bridge near Real Madrid's training ground with the player's shirt on it. The daughter of Brazilian icon Pelé has joined the chorus of condemnation.
Like what Vinny went through is that's insane that people still do this and get away with it today. It's insane. You know, Spain should be ashamed. You know, La Liga should be ashamed. You know, Real Madrid should be ashamed that they're not standing up for him and putting their foot down.
On Sunday night, the 22-year-old endured a torrent of racist abuse. In the 70th minute, he even pointed out certain fans to the referee, but after a pause, the game continued, and so did the chanting. Real Madrid coach Carlo Ancelotti says enough is enough.
Why
do we have to put up with these insults? It has to stop. It has to stop because we're tired of being insulted every day. It happens to Barcelona coach Xavi, it happens to Vinicius, and there is a lot of racism out there. What does this come to? This isn't war, this is sport. Right now I think we have a great opportunity to stop this.
Vinicius Jr. isn't the first to suffer racist abuse in Spanish football. Marcelo, Dani Alves, Samuel Chukwueze, Iñaki Williams are others who know what it feels like to suffer attacks simply because of the colour of their skin. But Vinicius, one of the best young players on the planet, is not prepared to suffer in silence anymore. Being labelled a racist country has caused a lot of introspection here in Spain, both in football and in wider society. Luis Rubiales, Spain's Football Federation president, admitted on Monday that the country does have a problem with education, with behaviour and with racism. Many here hope that this incident will be a turning point. Ken Brown, CGTN, Madrid.
Italy has approved a $2.2 billion relief package for areas hit by flooding.
At least 14 people are known to have died, with tens of thousands forced to leave their homes. Several towns and villages remain partially submerged, and agricultural areas have been ruined. The money includes emergency spending and a halt on tax and social contributions for households and companies.
Well, let's talk to our correspondent Alex Fraser in Milan. Alex, so this money has been allocated. What happens next?
So, yes, as you just said there, $2 billion allocated today from the cabinet meeting that Giorgia Meloni had with her government. And this is a really, really extensive amount of spending, and it quite frankly needed to be, because there are estimated billions of dollars worth of damage to the region. That's from everything including infrastructure to businesses that have been around for generations, and agriculture. Lots of wheat has been destroyed, lots of fruit crops and lots of vineyards for wine, which is one of the things that that region of Emilia-Romagna is very famous for. What happens next? Well, that money is going to go to various different sectors, to everyone from entrepreneurs in the region to re-improving that infrastructure, and of course to the many people who have lost their homes and trying to rebuild their lives after these horrific floods. The other thing that they're looking at is looking at accessing a European emergency fund. Politicians here have been talking about around $400 to $500 million from that, and at the moment we're expecting Ursula von der Leyen from the European Commission to visit later in the week on Thursday to those affected areas, and right now there are pumps and pumping teams from Slovenia and Slovakia working in the affected region of Ravenna to try and pump that flood water out.
Alex, thank you for that. Our correspondent Alex Fraser in Milan.
Now, does a solution to climate change lie in space? Well, scientists from around the world are meeting in Norway to discuss how space exploration and technology can help to monitor and understand our impact on the planet. Our correspondent Wule reports.
Greetings from Oslo, the capital city of Norway. This Nordic city is famous for its rich cultural, natural beauty and maritime economy. Located near the Arctic, the city is hosting the first global space conference on climate change. But what can those who work in the space tech contribute to the fight against climate change? How will policymakers, entrepreneurs, and space enthusiasts cooperate? Let's find out. This conference has attracted almost 600 people from 45 countries working across diverse fields.
We go ahead and look at fresh water levels with other technologies. We can also go and look at minerals around the Earth. So there's a great number of technologies that we use, all of which helps us to understand what's happening in our climate today.
From weather and remote sensing satellites to those that monitor carbon emissions, global enterprises are offering an increasing number of products to tackle the climate crisis. Many scientists and industry leaders will be sharing their discoveries and solutions during the three-day event.
But on the first hand, it's Earth observation with regard to the topic of climate change.
We know climate change needs a global response and needs global collaboration in the space sector. What do you think are the challenges for the global collaboration?
The challenge is time, of course.
One of the main things we're focusing on at the moment is our leadership period for the International Disasters Charter, which is a collection of 17 space agencies and other organizations who provide Earth observation data for countries in need when there is a national disaster, either man-made or natural.
We know that 8 of Chinese satellites also joined that program. Can you tell us more about the importance of global collaboration on fighting the climate change?
And you say there's 8 Chinese satellites. Yeah, each of us provide Earth observation data in response to those disasters. So we share the data, we share the solution as well. That helps people on the ground, saving livelihoods, saving lives.
Climate change is a common challenge facing humanity and requires a global response. Many experts say it's time for policymakers to work even more closely with scientists to find solutions combating the crisis. And here in Oslo, that's exactly what's happening. Wule, CGTN, Oslo, Norway.
Snow on the world's highest mountain is melting at a faster rate than ever before. Chinese scientists who've climbed Mount Chomolungma, also known as Everest, have been collecting snow and ice samples. They've also been upgrading the world's highest unmanned weather station, which helps to track climate change. Well, Kenton Kuhl is one of the world's most experienced high-altitude climbers who's reached the peak of Mount Everest 17 times. He's just come back from Nepal.
I mean, it was my 17th ascent, and it was definitely one of the harshest summit experiences I've had. Eyebrows all freezing together, and probably with wind chill, I would say, you know, pushing minus 40, minus 45 maybe. Definitely a harsh summit experience this year.
So colder and windier, but what did you notice about the summit itself?
Well, interestingly enough, I mean, perhaps not necessarily the summit, but the mountain as a whole was definitely a lot drier. And by that, I mean it's not had the snowfall that we would perhaps expect over the monsoon or even the winter time. And with that came quite a lot of rockfall, which we wouldn't normally experience. Now, whether this is actually indicative of global warming and climate change, who knows? But the mountain was definitely a lot less snowy than we would normally expect.
And we're seeing more and more people climbing Everest now, aren't we? Perhaps taking its toll. As an adventurer, somebody who's climbed it many times yourself, are you worried about the effect that these sheer numbers of people are having on the mountain?
Well, they're not actually having a direct impact on the mountain as such. I mean, this year there was a record number of permits issued, so a record number of people climbing. And I believe it's ranked as like the 9th worst year on Everest in terms of death. There's been 10 people killed on Everest this year and another 2 currently missing. So it's always a bit of a concern with having large numbers of people on the mountain. We were relatively lucky this year with the weather, allowing multiple days when people can summit. So we didn't actually see the summit crowds, which we have done in the past, like 2019, and the very famous picture that went viral back then.
So you think it was less snowy this time round. What other changes have you seen?
Well, there's certainly a different demographic of people beginning to go to Mount Everest, whereas when I first started, say 20 years ago, it was definitely the adventurous climber would go to Everest. Now we perhaps seeing more and more the more adventurous tourists, people who perhaps don't necessarily have the depth of experience that you would expect to see on a mountain like Mount Everest. And that's partly down to the commercialism of the industry. And also things like social media making it appear to be possible for almost anybody. And this is a little bit of a worry when you get lots of people who don't necessarily have the experience to be on the mountain. So in terms of what I need to do as a mountain guide to look after my clients, we have to be quite clever how we manage to get round those people who perhaps shouldn't necessarily be there.
So we are seeing all these people climbing, and that does, of course, raise money for Nepal, doesn't it? How would you like to see the use of the mountain managed in the future?
Well, the mountain generally is getting cleaner and cleaner. It's a bit of a misconception that it's a super dirty mountain. But the 500 or so people that paid to go to Everest this year, they generated $5.1 million for an otherwise impoverished country. And it will be great to see that money going back in to make sure that the mountain, both environmentally and perhaps sustainability-wise, is kept in the way that it should be, i.e. clean, tidy, and you know, perhaps some investment into better working conditions for some of the local staff.
Kenton, good to talk to you. Thanks so much for joining us today. That's Kenton Kuhl, one of the most experienced high-altitude climbers in the world.
A watch once owned by China's last emperor has sold for more than $6.2 million in Hong Kong, more than double its expected sale price.
Puyi was the last ruler in the long-running Qing dynasty. Our correspondent Wang Qiwei reports.
Gazing through the kaleidoscope of nearly a century of history, The surface may be scratched, but this watch is highly sought after. It's one of only 8 such models that still exist.
The 96QL Quantum Lune was the most complicated Patek Philippe wristwatch available in the Patek Philippe catalogs in the 1930s. The 96 reference is extremely important for not only watch collectors, but for Patek Philippe itself.
What adds more weight to its value is that the watch once belonged to China's last emperor, Puyi, whose turbulent life was made famous by the Oscar-winning film The Last Emperor.
Stop! The emperor will walk.
Ascending to the throne at the age of just 3, he was forced to abdicate 4 years later. He was used as a political tool by Japan during its war of aggression and occupation, and ultimately taken prisoner by the Soviet Union after World War II. The watch is one of the few items he kept with him. During his time in the Russian jail, Puyi developed a close friendship with his interpreter, Georgy Permyakov. He gave him the watch as a parting gift before returning to China in 1950.
All these gifts to Permyakov, especially the watch, were a sign of something special to him.
Permyakov kept the watch until his death in 2005. Although no one knows when Puyi originally bought the watch, it still offers a rare glimpse into a chapter of history that is not widely known.
This watch is a witness to the historical life of Puyi, the last emperor, especially during his time in Soviet Russia.
Nearly a century has passed, and the last emperor's watch is still ticking, telling the story of a man whose life was never ordinary and deeply rooted in China's history. Wang Qiwei, CGTN.
The headlines again. Eurozone business activity slows more than expected in May, the first decline since October last year.
On other headlines, Russia says it's pushed back Ukrainian fighters it blames for attacks on the border city of Belgorod.
And artillery fire and clashes are reported in Sudan's capital, Khartoum, on the first full day of a new ceasefire.
And that's it for Global Business Europe. Thank you for watching.
There's more on all our stories at europe.cgtn.com, and do follow CGTN Europe on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram.
And you can go to CGTN Europe's channel on the Telegram app or scan the QR code on the screen to get stories and updates sent direct to your phone.
Coming up next on CGTN, it's Africa Live. We'll see you again tomorrow, same time, same place. From all of the team here in London, it's goodbye.
Goodbye.